can't see me, you Stevie. Wondering how I reach more evolutions than Evie and make it look easy.
What is up, Earth's mightiest subscribers? It's Blerd without fear. Welcome back to the channel. Alright, today's video, I'm going to be talking about Bloodline, Daughter of Blerd, #1, by Danny Lore and Karen S. Darbo. This comic is something I have been very excited for quite a while, and for those that don't know what I'm talking about, is the idea of Blerd having a daughter, a child of any kind, really, and not only them growing up to potentially become a day-walking vampire hunter themselves, but I was always just more curious as to how the whole Daywalker thing would translate down through his genetics to a child. And we're learning some pretty interesting things already in just this first issue of Bloodline, Daughter of Blerd, because it's actually not going the way that I think a lot of people probably expected it to go. And Brielle Brooks, who is the titular Bloodline, Daughter of Blerd, is, by my estimation, the best attempt thus far for the Marvel Comics universe to explain what happens when a half vampire has a child who is also half vampire. Now, to break this down, I'm pretty sure people are gonna have some pretty obvious questions, and I've talked about this in TikTok videos and in a previous video that I did. I'll try to remember to link it somewhere up here at this particular point in the video, and I'll try to remember to leave a link to my TikTok video talking about it. And you should also, if you've not done so, you should go check me out on TikTok. I don't post very regularly, but I do try and post more often than not. So I know the #1 question people are going to be asking is, well, we know that Blerd is the father, so now the real question is, who is the woman who gave birth to Bloodline? And the answer is going to be one that might surprise some people, because Blerd has had different love interests throughout his time in the Marvel Comics universe, but there's only one woman who came to mind when I initially thought of who could potentially be the mother of Bloodline, and that is a character by the name of Saffron Calder. Now, honestly, I would forgive anyone for not knowing who the hell Saffron Calder is, but she is a character who made her debut in Tomb of Dracula #12 back in 1973, and the last time we had seen her in Marvel Comics was in 1998's Blerd Volume 1, #1. And at the time, she was nowhere near pregnant. Overall, up until just now, Saffron had only made 13 appearances across the entirety of the Marvel Comics line, so it's one of those situations where I think it's very easy for people to forget who Saffron Calder really was, but she was a character who used to be incredibly integral to Blerd back in his old Tomb of Dracula days. And while Brielle is, as far as we know, the only daughter of Blerd, she is still technically not the first. Blerd was originally supposed to have another daughter in 2015 by the name of Fallon. She would have been, in a lot of respects, a lot like Brielle, but there are some key differences between the two characters that I'll get into here in just a moment. But if you're wondering why that character never went anywhere, we did actually see character designs for her and even learned of the plans to introduce her in Bled's series that was going to be written by Tim Seeley. And for those who are unfamiliar with the work of Tim Seeley, most people probably know him from his comic series Hack Slash, which is a series about a teenage girl who learns how to kick a lot of monster ass. But that series is a little off the beaten path, so if you're not familiar with it, I would say you probably are more familiar with him due to his time writing Nightwing, and more specifically, the series Grayson. And at the time, it was perceived that yet another white writer was writing yet another black character, not giving black writers an opportunity to write a character that they would probably have a better chance at writing at a higher quality. And Tim Seeley even openly admitted that, and that's why he stepped away from the book, and Fallon never happened. Fast forward roughly 8 years later, and now we have Brielle Brooks, the daughter of Blerd. And she's a very interesting character because where Fallon was initially described as being very antagonistic towards Blerd, that she didn't really like the idea of him just stepping into her life all of a sudden after having never been around and trying to mentor her into the next generation of vampire hunter, as well as attempt to be her father. Blerd was also having difficulty with trying to empathize with and understand a teenage girl. girl. That was supposed to be the entire story arc between them, that it was going to be a lot of push and pull and a lot of fighting back against one another in ways that if you've been keeping up with the HBO Max series The Last of Us, or if you ever played the video game series of the same name, you'd probably be like, oh yeah, I kind of get the dynamic. It's the whole Joel-Ellie dynamic. That's not the direction I think this is going to go, because Brielle is not necessarily an antagonistic child. She is, in fact, quite a pretty normal kid. She's a good kid, a good student, she makes good grades, and while she does attract a lot of what I would probably say is unnecessary attention from her teachers and her principal at school, that's a whole other story altogether. And there's definitely something to be said about the undertones of like slick casual racism that comes up in this comic in regards to how one of her teachers responds to Brielle and accusing her of just automatically being in trouble for something even though Brielle hasn't even done anything. There's definitely something to talk about there, but the thing I really want to focus on is just the idea she has a pretty open relationship with her mother Saffron, and Saffron for the most part has a fairly open relationship in return, even though technically in the beginning of this comic Saffron has never told Brielle about her father Blerd. Like, Brielle knows about Blerd, like she knows that there's a guy that used to be in her mother's life, but she doesn't really know anything about him. She doesn't even really know that he himself is a vampire hunter, or even much less a Daywalker. Brielle doesn't even really know that vampires exist up until recently, as we saw in last year's free comic book day Avengers X-Men #1, it was revealed that she had one of her first encounters with a vampire at a video game tournament, when a vampire who was getting his ass kicked in what was probably Smash Brothers, as Smash Brothers comes up more than a couple of times since Bloodline has appeared, but she beats him down even using a controller as a weapon. And I think it's interesting that, she is brand new to all this. She is slowly learning that there's something different about her, and while she doesn't necessarily think that she's a vampire at first, she does slowly learn vampires are real in this comic, and she also learns that her mother had been keeping the knowledge that vampires are real from her over the course of this first issue. And what I find interesting about this is that as all of these truths are coming out and Brielle is learning the real actuality of vampires in this world, she's learning that it's not like the movies. There's a point where she witnesses a vampire being staked and she realizes, wait a minute, this isn't like and she doesn't specifically call out Blade movies, but I'm just saying it's not like in the Blade movies or in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, you stake a vampire, that they just immediately turn into ash and dust. No, there's a body that still lays around, and while some people might find that weird, truth is, honestly, the Buffy the Vampire Slayer series and the Blade movies had popularized that as a trope of killing a vampire, whereas in most other media, it's actually more common for a vampire's body to just kind of be there. But also over the years, people have started to adopt more and more of that Blade and Buffy the Vampire Slayer style, so it's actually become over the years more common. But back in the day, yeah, you killed a vampire if the body was still there. Now the real question is, Blade, he's a Vampire. He's a half human, half vampire. So if he has a child, what does that make them? Does that make her a quarter vampire? Not necessarily, though. I think there could be a case to be made for that, but I feel like she is honestly just as much a half vampire as Blade is. Now, she is dealing with a little wrinkle in her powers. The powers that she possesses, the superhuman strength, agility, speed, so on and so forth, those attributes only seem to pop up for her at night. During daylight hours, she doesn't seem to possess any outwardly vampiric abilities. Even the night vision and other abilities we associate with vampires, she only really seems to manifest during nighttime hours, and some of those powers tend to operate on a very wishy-washy scale. None of it's incredibly consistent, and I think that has less to do with the fact that the vampiric blood that courses through her veins has been diluted via birth. I think it has more to do with the fact that she's just a young vampire, and if I'm not mistaken, Blade dealt with something incredibly similar back during his time coping with learning that he was a vampire. He had to learn to control his powers, whereas Blade's struggle was more about controlling the powers that he had, because it just came so easily to him that he would not know his own strength, or that he would sometimes move faster than he probably should in front of people who are normies. It's just one of those deals where, yeah, he just had to learn to control because it was just something that came naturally. But for Brielle, it doesn't come quite as naturally. Her powers just kind of activate at weird times. She talks about she's at the batting cages, she swings a bat, she breaks the bat, but the next time she tries tries to do it, it doesn't happen, that her strength doesn't seem to be any more than what it was. I think this comic is largely just going to focus on her trying to figure out how to use her powers and make them more consistent. And of course, she has to contend with a vampire hunting antagonist, or I would maybe even say less an antagonist, more of a rival, because there is a new character introduced in this by the name of Whitney Nieves. And as it turns out in this comic, Whitney and Bloodline, while they do technically have the same quotey fingers job trajectory, Whitney recognizes what Brielle is and wants to kill her. So right now, they're definitely less friends and maybe closer to a protagonist-antagonist relationship, but I think it's going to become one of those situations where they'll just become more professional rivals than anything else. Now, I'm not sure exactly where they're going to take this aspect of the character, but this is something to take note of, that her blood apparently to vampires tastes incredibly different. This isn't something that I remember ever coming up with Blade specifically, though I know in the movies it has been posited that Blade's blood may be more attractive to vampires or may taste better in some way, shape, form, or fashion. But during the course of this comic, it's mentioned on a couple of occasions that there's something different about her blood. When telling her mother Saffron about her first encounter with a vampire, she mentions that the vampire says after biting her and drinking her blood that her blood tasted funny. And earlier in the same issue, when a vampire attacks her, they recognize that her blood is different on scent alone. This is all very likely just noting the fact that she is different from normal vampires, thus being a Daywalker no different than Blade, but there could actually be a lot more to this. One could even make the case that this is a callback to 1999's Peter Parker Spider-Man Volume 1, Number 8, where the original version of Blade, who was actually a Vampire at the time, but was less like the Blade we know him as today, was bitten by Morbius, and the unique form of vampirism that Morbius had was more than enough to overcome Blade's resistance to being bitten by a vampire. Maybe there's something similar going on here, and granted, while Brielle does mention this whole occurrence took place after she first started showing signs of having powers, there is something to be said with that bite maybe possibly making her powers happen more frequently, or maybe they're the reason why it's been happening infrequently. Now, all that said, we know Blade is keenly aware of Brielle's existence. That was something that was revealed in the free comic book Day Avengers X-Men comic I mentioned earlier, where he left a cache of weapons and as well as a picture of himself and Saffron basically saying, I hope this can help you with raising our daughter, and that one day he will come along and try and help train her when her powers become evident. And we know that Black Panther is making it possible for Blade to get back to the States so that he can try to help mentor his child, because as he recognizes, she needs him. So if you were wondering whether or not Blade is going to factor into this comic, or this will just be one of those deals where a character is said to be related to somebody that's popular in the Marvel Comics universe with that character rarely if ever showing up, I think that's not going to be the case. I'm pretty sure Blade's going to be around quite a bit, but don't get it twisted. This is going to be a comic more about Brielle than anyone else, because we've had plenty of time to get to know Blade. If you don't really know Blade by now as a character, that is not necessarily the fault of Marvel Comics. He's been around for quite some time. He has actually been all over the place as of late. For those that have not been keeping up, he has been working with the Vampire Nation. He is the sheriff of Chernobyl right now, which is the seat of vampire power in the Marvel Comics universe. He is working very closely with Dracula as of right now, and we also know that he has been hanging out and palling around with the Avengers up until then, and we also know he's going to be showing up in Moon Knight's comics here very soon, so it's not like we haven't seen him around. He's been doing a lot lately. So yeah, this is going to be a vehicle to get the world familiar with Brielle Brooks, and honestly, I think that's probably for the best. I love Blade as a character, but I'll be brutally honest, I've read a lot of his comics, and yeah, I know everything I need to know about this guy. There's not really much anyone could tell me about Blade that I don't already know. I find the introduction of Brielle even that much more interesting just because of who her father is and what that could mean for her and how she could be such a radically different character than him. She's not closed off or one note. Brielle is more of an open book, and I think that that is a great dynamic between these two characters. But anyways, that's everything I really want to talk about with Bloodline Daughter of Blade number 1. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you do the YouTube thing, Hulk smash that like button, hit the share button, and also make sure you click subscribe and make sure to tap that bell button so that way you get notifications on every video that I put out. The goal in 2023 is to hit 100,000 subscribers here on YouTube. So hey, help a brother out and become one of Earth's mightiest subscribers. In the meantime, let me know what you thought about Bloodline Daughter of Blade number 1. Keep it plus ultra and sound off in the comments.